The frontier was a wild place of deep forests, wide rivers, and long silence. It shaped men differently. Some came to it and broke. Others learned to walk with it. George Rogers Clark was one of the few who understood it like a second heartbeat. He was born in 1752 in Virginia, into a large family where survival was earned, not given. His childhood was not gentle. The land itself trained him. He learned to hold an axe before he could properly read a book. He learned to track deer before he learned to write his name. By the time he was 12, his eyes were sharp and observant. He spoke only when he had something to say. He spent most of his youth in the woods. He moved through brush quietly, as if the trees made space for him. He watched the animals closely. He noticed how the birds stopped singing before danger. He studied how footprints changed shape when someone was tired or afraid. The wilderness did not frighten him. It sharpened him. On the frontier, he crossed paths with the native tribes who knew the land better than any European ever could. He saw how the Shawnee, the Miami, and the Delaware traveled light, moved fast, and fought in silence. He saw how they struck only when the land favored them. He paid attention. Others dismissed them. He learned from them. He understood that a man who knows the land can defeat an army that does not. That lesson rested quietly inside him, waiting. As he grew older, he became a surveyor. This job demanded courage. Surveyors walked into places no maps showed. They saw forests no one else had seen. They measured rivers that had no names yet. Day by day, George walked lands that would one day become Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. At that time, they were only untamed wilderness. But he saw more. He saw possibility. In those silent miles, an idea began to take shape inside him. A belief. The colonies and Britain were heading toward conflict. Everyone could feel it. The talk of freedom was spreading. The world was changing. And George understood that when the time came, the real battle for the future of the young nation would not only be fought in the cities. It would be fought out here, on the frontier, in the forests, along the rivers, where the land itself decided who survived. He was quiet about this. He did not boast. He did not announce anything. He simply prepared. The frontier was sharpening a weapon no one noticed yet. And when the first spark of the revolution finally lit the fire, George Rogers Clark was already watching the horizon, waiting for his moment, waiting for the war that would call him forward, waiting for the chance to change the fate of a nation before it was even born. The war for independence began in the East, but George Rogers Clark was far from Boston and Philadelphia. He listened to news of rebellion carried by traders on riverboats and messengers on horseback. The fighting was distant, yet the consequences were already reaching the frontier. Settlers were tense. Native nations were choosing sides. And the British saw something clearly. Whoever controlled the West would shape the new continent. Clark understood this better than anyone in Virginia or Congress. To them, the frontier was a distant wilderness they barely considered. To him, it was the future. He saw that if the British and their allied tribes controlled the great valleys beyond the Ohio River, the revolution would fail even if the colonies won battles in the East. A new nation could not survive cornered against the Atlantic. It needed land. It needed rivers. It needed room to grow. He decided that someone had to defend the frontier, and no one was coming from the East to do it. He gathered men. Not trained soldiers. Frontiersmen. Farmers. Hunters. Men hardened by weather and scarcity. They trusted Clark because he did not speak like a politician. He spoke like someone who would stand beside them in danger. They elected him leader without ceremony. He was 23 years old. The British, operating out of Fort Detroit and its network of outposts, began supporting raids against American settlers. Small cabins were burned. Families fled back east. The frontier trembled. But Clark did not. He traveled to Williamsburg, the capital of Virginia, and stood before Governor Patrick Henry to make his case. The West must not be abandoned. If the revolution is to survive, we must strike not defensively but boldly, deep into British territory. Henry listened, but others in the government dismissed the idea as reckless. They could not imagine striking British forts hundreds of miles through wilderness with no supply lines. They saw it as impossible. Clark saw it as necessary. Patrick Henry saw something in him. The quiet fire. The clear purpose. He approved Clark's plan in secret. No public announcement. No fanfare. A sealed document and a few £1,000 of powder and supplies. Enough to raise a force. But not enough to fail. If Clark succeeded, the young United States would gain an empire. If he failed, no one in Congress would admit they ever supported him. Clark returned to the frontier with a mission known only to a few. He had chosen his battlefield. The British strongholds of Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes. Forts spread across thousands of miles of forest and waterways. Clark studied every map, every river bend, every trail used by hunters and traders. Most commanders planned from strategy tables. Clark planned with mud on his boots and wind in his face. He kept his purpose hidden even from many of his own men. They believed they were simply defending the Virginia frontier. Only when they were already committed to the expedition did he reveal the truth. They would not defend. They would conquer. Silence fell when he said it. Some stared in disbelief. Some smiled with the excitement of the impossible. All of them listened. A handful of frontiersmen, under a young, quiet, intense leader, would march into the heart of British territory with no reinforcements, no supply lines, and no certainty of return. Clark knew the odds. But he also knew the land. And he knew one more thing. Fortune does not wait for hesitant men. He would move first. He would move fast. Before anyone understood what was happening, the West would belong to him. They came together quietly along the banks of the Ohio River in the summer heat. A few families in the nearby settlements watched them gather, never realizing what this small band of men intended to do. There were fewer than 200 of them. Some were barely older than boys. Others were weathered hunters with hard eyes. None were professional soldiers. They carried long rifles, tomahawks, and whatever courage they could find inside themselves. Many had wives and children they left behind without promises. They knew the risks. On the frontier, death was not a stranger. It was a neighbor. Clark looked over them without speech or dramatic display. He did not try to inspire them with big words. He simply told the truth. The future of the frontier would be decided by whoever controlled the Mississippi Valley. If the British held the region, the colonies would be trapped. If the Americans claimed it, the West would open like a great door. The men listened. They understood. They had lived the danger. They carried their purpose in silence. They stepped into flat-bottomed boats and pushed into the current. The Ohio River carried them west. The forests on either bank seemed endless, dark, and alive. Some nights they sang to keep spirits steady. Other nights they moved in absolute silence, hearing only the stroke of oars and the whisper of water against wood. Clark stood often at the bow, scanning the shores, calculating distance, reading the signs of the land like a language. There was no road, no map that could truly help him. Only instinct and memory. When they reached a point far enough west, they left the boats and marched overland. The wilderness closed around them. The heat was heavy. Swarms of insects stung their skin. The ground was thick with mud that swallowed boots to the ankle. They carried only what they could on their backs. Food grew scarce. Hunger walked among them. But Clark did not slow. He moved like the land itself was guiding him. Along the way, they encountered French settlers. These were not British loyalists. They were people who had lived under shifting flags for years. Many had little love for the British governor stationed in the region. Clark's arrival surprised them. They had heard no whispers of American forces coming this far. Clark spoke to them calmly, respectfully. He assured them that they sought not conquest, but freedom from British rule. The French listened. They considered. They decided. They opened their doors. This moment changed everything. Clark now had eyes, ears, and guides who knew every path, every trading road, and every political mood in the region. He learned that Kaskaskia, the first target, was not expecting any attack. The British believed no force could reach them through this wilderness without large numbers and heavy supplies. They relied on distance and the landscape to shield them. They did not expect a man who had grown up inside that landscape. Night fell over Kaskaskia when Clark and his men approached. The town slept. The fort was quiet. Clark ordered silence. No war cries. No drums. No warning. They moved like shadows. The door to the fort was unguarded. The British were comfortable. Too comfortable. In a single burst of movement, Clark's men poured in. The guards awoke too late. Torches lit. Shouts erupted. But the fight never truly began. The fort surrendered before any blood spilled. A stronghold had fallen without a battle. Word spread to nearby Cahokia. Many of the French villagers came forward willingly and declared allegiance to the American cause. Some shook Clark's hand with relief. Others offered food and guidance. The map of the frontier began to change shape. But the British still held Vincennes. And Vincennes held the key to everything. It sat on the Wabash River like a gateway. Whoever controlled it controlled the flow of people and power in the region. The British commander there was a man known for his confidence, his control, and his belief in British supremacy. His name was Henry Hamilton. The men in the frontier called him the hair buyer. They believed he paid for American scalps to fuel fear and maintain control. Whether the stories were all true or partly legend did not matter. His reputation was enough. He was feared. He was ruthless. And now he knew about Clark. Clark had struck first. But Hamilton was preparing to strike back. And winter was coming. Everything that had happened so far would look small compared to what was about to begin. Winter settled over the frontier like a heavy hand. Rivers froze at their edges. The wind that once whispered now cut through clothing like a blade. Snow lay over the ground, hiding dangers beneath a quiet white surface. For most armies, winter meant rest. For George Rogers Clark, it was the moment of truth. News reached him that Henry Hamilton had returned to Vincennes. Hamilton moved confidently. He believed the British still controlled the West. He believed Clark's victories were temporary. He believed that a small band of frontiersmen could not hold territory against an empire. He was preparing to strike in the spring, drive Clark out, and crush every settlement that had dared to hope for a new nation. Clark understood something Hamilton did not. Waiting meant death. If Hamilton attacked first, the frontier would burn. Families would be hunted. Settlers would flee. Everything gained would be lost. Clark looked at his men and saw exhaustion. Supplies were low. Ammunition was limited. Food was disappearing. The wise decision, the practical decision, was to fortify and wait for warmer weather. Clark did not choose the practical decision. He chose the impossible. He would march to Vincennes. Right away. In the dead of winter. Across flooded plains and frozen marshland. Across ground that could swallow horses whole. Across miles of land where there was no shelter, no food, and no guarantee of survival. He called his men together in a cold room lit by a single fire. He told them the truth again. If we do not move now, the dream of this land will die. If we wait, Hamilton will destroy all we have done. If we march, we may starve. We may drown. We may fall. But if we succeed, the West is ours forever. The room was silent. A silence of men thinking about home. About their wives. About their children. About death. Then, slowly, one man stepped forward. Then another. And another. Until the choice was made without loud words or dramatic pledges. They would march. The journey began under a gray sky. The ground was wet and thick, turning every step into struggle. The Wabash River had overflowed its banks, turning the plains into a vast inland sea of icy water. Clark's men waded waist-deep for miles. They carried their rifles above their heads to keep them dry. Their clothes froze stiff. Their fingers turned blue and numb. Some could barely speak. Others looked ahead without expression, surviving by will alone. Clark never walked behind them. He walked at the front. His face was calm. His pace never changed. They watched him. They drew strength from the steadiness of his steps. If he could keep moving, they could too. Days passed. Water rose to their chests. Men lifted the smallest among them on logs. The tall carried the weak. Hunger gnawed at them. Some had gone nearly 2 days without food. A few collapsed and had to be lifted forward by others. Clark spoke rarely, but when he did, it was simple. We are close. Do not surrender to the cold. Do not surrender to hunger. The enemy expects spring. We will arrive like thunder in winter. Finally, they saw the lights of Vincennes through the trees. A few fires glowing in the distance. The British inside the fort felt safe. They believed the flooded fields protected them. They believed no army could reach them now. They were not prepared for men who had walked through suffering without bending. Clark sent word into the town that he had arrived. The message spread fast. Many of the French settlers there still remembered his fairness. Some brought food in secret. Others whispered the position of British guards. The people did not cry out or panic. The fort remained unaware. The men who had nearly frozen now stood in silence, watching the British flag flutter over the walls of Fort Sackville. Their bodies were weak, but their purpose had never been stronger. Clark looked at the fort in the cold evening light. Everything they had done, everything they had risked, every mile of frozen water they had crossed, it all led to this moment. He raised his hand. The attack began. The first shots cracked through the cold air and echoed across the town. Smoke rose faintly as muskets fired, the sound sharp against the still winter night. Clark's men moved with silent precision. They took positions behind fences, barns, and corners of houses. They did not shout. They did not waste bullets. Every shot had to count. They were too tired and too hungry for anything else. Inside the fort, the British scrambled awake. Officers shouted orders. Drums beat. Lanterns flickered along the walls. Henry Hamilton rushed to the ramparts, expecting to see a large army. Instead, he saw shadows. Shapes. Men who seemed to multiply with every movement. Clark had ordered his men to spread out widely and fire from many directions. The British could not see how many they faced. They believed they were surrounded by a force twice, maybe 3 times its real size. Hamilton tried to respond with cannons, but Clark placed his sharpshooters in positions where they could strike any man who tried to load or aim. Every time a gunner showed himself on the fort walls, a rifle cracked and he fell. Slowly, the British artillery went silent. The night settled into a steady pulse of controlled fire. Clark's men were careful. They did not waste powder. They had traveled too far to lose now. By dawn, the town of Vincennes was firmly in Clark's hands. Only the fort remained. Hamilton refused to surrender. He believed that the Americans, exhausted and short on ammunition, would eventually break. He believed he only had to endure. He did not understand the kind of men Clark commanded. Men who had crossed icy rivers for days without shoes. Men who had marched on empty stomachs with frozen hands. Men who had already suffered beyond what Hamilton could imagine. There was no more fear left in them. Clark sent a message to the fort. A simple invitation to discuss terms. They met in a small house within sight of the walls. The talk was cold. Measured. Clark did not raise his voice. Hamilton attempted to maintain dignity. Clark informed him that his forces had full control of the town. Hamilton insisted the fort could hold. Clark looked into his eyes and saw certainty. So he returned to his men and prepared a demonstration. British prisoners taken during the night were marched in front of the fort. Among them were men accused of leading raids on frontier families. The stories had circulated for months. Burned cabins. Murdered settlers. Scalps traded like trophies. Clark had seen the aftermath with his own eyes. He believed Hamilton rewarded such actions. And now, in full view of the fort walls, he ordered that those proven guilty of these atrocities would face justice. The shots echoed. The message was unmistakable. Hamilton watched from the ramparts. His face changed. He understood now that Clark was not a reckless upstart. He was a man of absolute resolve. A commander who could not be intimidated. A leader who had earned the loyalty of men who would walk through death for him. Another message was sent. Short. Final. The fort must surrender. Hours passed. Silence weighed over the frozen ground. Inside the fort, Hamilton considered the truth. Reinforcements would not arrive. The American force was not breaking apart. And the longer he held out, the greater the risk to everyone under his command. As darkness approached, a white flag rose slowly above the walls. The gate opened. The British soldiers marched out and laid down their arms. Clark stood with his men watching in silence. No cheers. No shouts. Only the deep relief of survival. The fort was taken. The key to the West had fallen. The British power in the Northwest Territory began to unravel. Word would travel east. And when it reached the Continental Congress, they would finally understand what Clark had already known. The fate of a nation had been decided far from the coast. Not in grand cities, but in frozen rivers, muddy plains, and a winter march that should have broken the men who made it. But it did not break them. Because George Rogers Clark never allowed himself to break. The victory at Vincennes spread like a quiet shock through the frontier. It was not the kind of victory that poets in Philadelphia knew how to praise yet. There were no grand uniforms, no polished flags, no marching bands. It was a triumph born of hunger, cold, and sheer will. But the people who lived on the edge of the wilderness understood. They knew the difference between living under fear and living with a chance at peace. And they understood that the chance had come because one man refused to accept what others called impossible. Clark did not stay still after the victory. He strengthened alliances with the French communities. He sat at tables with tribal messengers. He knew the West was not land to be taken by force and held by fear. He had seen enough to recognize that respect was a form of power. He walked through villages not as a conqueror but as a man who understood the land belonged to all who depended on it. Some tribes listened. Some remained cautious. But Clark did not speak with arrogance. He spoke with clarity. If the British returned, the war would swallow everyone again. The months passed. The revolution in the East raged on. New York and Philadelphia filled the newspapers with reports of battles, generals, and political debates. The leaders of the young nation were still trying to define what freedom meant. Many of them barely thought about the West. But the British did. They still dreamed of reclaiming the Mississippi Valley, pushing the Americans back to the coast, and ending the idea of a nation that stretched across a continent. Clark understood that the war was not finished. He planned new campaigns. He mapped new routes. He asked for support. But in the East, the leaders were tired. Funds were scarce. The war felt endless. The frontier was distant. Clark received promises instead of supplies. Applause instead of reinforcements. Respect instead of resources. And respect cannot feed soldiers. His own men began to suffer. Many had fought for the promise of land and security. But the government was slow to recognize claims. Paper moved through offices while the frontier moved through seasons. Clark watched men who had walked through death now struggle through disappointment. The war ended, and the Treaty of Paris was signed. The United States was recognized as a nation. And in that treaty, something extraordinary appeared. The boundary lines included the entire Northwest Territory. The land Clark had fought for. The land Congress had once believed unreachable. The land his winter march had won. The new nation gained almost a third of its eventual territory because of him. Maps changed. Borders shifted. The United States was no longer a small cluster of colonies pressed against the ocean. It was a nation with room to grow. But Clark himself did not grow in wealth or comfort. He had given everything to the cause. And the government, drained and disorganized, repaid him with thanks instead of payment. He spent years fighting for what was owed to him. Papers lost. Promises delayed. Recognition faded while new heroes rose in the East. His health began to decline. The war had taken from him more than time. A wound worsened over the years, and eventually, his right leg had to be amputated. He spent his later days in a small cabin, overlooking the river that had once carried him into history. People visited him sometimes. Young soldiers, settlers, leaders. They came to hear his stories. But Clark did not tell them as legends. He told them as memories, quiet and unpolished. He spoke not of glory, but of decisions, of responsibility, of the cost a man pays when he chooses to lead. He did not ask for pity. He did not express regret. He lived his final years the same way he had lived his youth, with a calm that came from knowing he had walked his path fully and without hesitation. George Rogers Clark died in 1818. There were no parades, no speeches that shook cities, but there was something greater: the shape of a nation, the land that would one day become Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the great spaces beyond the Appalachian Mountains, the heartland of a country that would one day stretch from coast to coast. He had seen it before it existed. He had believed in it when no one else understood. And he had walked into frozen water to claim it. His life was not decorated. It was carved into the earth. George Rogers Clark was born in 1752 in Albemarle County, Virginia, in a world still defined by the British Crown. From an early age, he was drawn to the vast wilderness of the Ohio Valley. The forests, rivers, and untamed lands called to him, shaping his character into one of courage, resilience, and unyielding determination. Clark grew tall and strong, his sharp mind paired with a daring spirit. He trained with rifles and canoes, learning to navigate the wilds and read the land as his ancestors had. The stories of frontier life, of settlers fighting to survive, ignited a fire within him. He felt a deep calling to defend his home and push the boundaries of the young colonies against threats that loomed on the western frontier. When the Revolutionary War erupted, Clark saw an opportunity not only to fight for independence but to protect the frontier communities that had nurtured him. Clark joined the Virginia militia and quickly earned respect for his leadership and daring strategies. In 1778, at just 26 years old, he undertook one of the most ambitious campaigns of the war. The British, allied with hostile Native American tribes, controlled forts across the Ohio Valley, threatening settlers and expanding their influence. Clark devised a bold plan to strike at their heart. With a small force of fewer than 200 men, he set out on a grueling march through freezing rivers, dense forests, and rugged terrain. The men endured hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion, yet Clark's unshakable resolve inspired them to push forward. Each step brought them closer to the British outposts that seemed impregnable. Clark understood that the element of surprise, the courage of his men, and careful strategy were their only advantages. Every night by the campfire, he spoke to his soldiers not as a commander but as a fellow fighter, instilling belief that they could achieve what seemed impossible. In February 1779, Clark's force reached Kaskaskia, a British-controlled village in Illinois. The settlement was lightly defended, and Clark seized the moment. Under the cover of darkness, his men surrounded the town, moving silently through the shadows. The villagers, caught off guard, surrendered without a fight. This victory was a turning point. Clark secured Kaskaskia without bloodshed, showing both skill and a deep understanding of diplomacy. Word spread quickly among other settlements and Native American tribes. Clark's audacity and vision sent shockwaves through the region, signaling that the American cause had reached the western frontier. Encouraged by this success, Clark pressed onward to Fort Vincennes. The fort, held by the British, was strategically vital. Capturing it would solidify American control over the Ohio Valley. In the dead of winter, Clark led a daring expedition across flooded plains and ice-covered rivers. The journey tested every ounce of endurance, yet he never wavered. His men, inspired by his fearless leadership, followed him with unwavering loyalty. When Clark arrived at Fort Vincennes in February 1779, he faced a formidable challenge. The British garrison, reinforced and confident, had no expectation of an attack in such harsh conditions. Clark used clever tactics to deceive and intimidate them. He arranged his men to make the fort appear heavily guarded, creating the illusion of a larger force. The British commander, unsure of the true strength of Clark's army, ultimately surrendered after a brief exchange, granting Clark one of the most remarkable victories of the Revolutionary War. This triumph secured the Illinois country for the Americans and disrupted British plans to control the western frontier. Clark's campaign became legendary, earning him admiration from both settlers and leaders. He had achieved an extraordinary feat with limited resources, navigating treacherous landscapes, facing extreme weather, and confronting an enemy that was better equipped and positioned. His name spread across the colonies as a hero of the frontier, a man whose vision, courage, and tenacity had changed the course of the war in the West. After the war, George Rogers Clark returned to the frontier, his fame recognized but his personal life filled with challenges. He struggled with debts and the hardships of the new nation he had fought to protect. Despite the difficulties, he remained a symbol of courage and determination, a reminder of the sacrifices made to secure freedom. His legacy endured through the settlements he saved, the lands he secured, and the generations inspired by his story. Clark's campaigns demonstrated that intelligence, boldness, and unwavering belief in a cause could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. The forests and rivers that had shaped him as a young boy became the stage upon which he carved his place in history. Today, George Rogers Clark is remembered not only as a military genius but as a frontier hero whose vision and bravery helped shape the United States. His story is a testament to the power of leadership, courage, and the relentless pursuit of freedom, echoing through the wilderness he once called home.